I mean, I don't want to get into it before we're into it, but just all of these issues about, bodily autonomy, you can't really separate the issues about women's reproductive rights and those kinds of issues from sexual assault. And that was an interesting part of the book too, because there are players in the story who advocate for the protection of one thing and not the other.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's complicated.
Hello and welcome to At the Podium with me, Patrick Huey. At the Podium is a multimedia platform that brings together people from a diverse background of lives, careers, and experiences who all share one thing in common. They have stepped fully into the transformative power of finding and raising their voices to make an impact on the world we live in today. At the Podium holds a space for everyone to share their stories, to be heard, and to bring us inspiration. Today, I'm thrilled to share the podium again with Nora Zelevansky. Nora Zelevansky is the author of 3 novels, Competitive Grieving, Will You, Won't You, Want Me, and Semi-Charmed Life. And she is the co-author of the nonfiction book, Roll, Red, Roll, Rape, Power, and Football in the American Heartland. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Elle, Town and Country, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Vanity Fair, among others. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband, 2 kids, and one enormous cat, Waldo. Nora, welcome back to At the Podium.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for having me.
It's so great to have you back on the show. It's kind of a different conversation for us because the last time we spoke, we were talking about your latest novel that was published, Competitive Grieving. And today we're going to talk about, I think, a very timely and difficult subject, which you co-wrote about with Nancy Schwartzman in the book, Roll, Red, Roll, which was also a documentary, which is now on Netflix. It was very provocative and moving to me when I read it.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to talking about it because it's a really complicated and, as you said, timely topic. So
it really is. And when I was reading the book, this passage really hooked me into the story as I was reading the book. And what you all wrote was, what surprised me most was that despite the overwhelming evidence created by the teenage boys themselves, despite the ensuing rallies, the trial, and later the grand jury investigation of school officials and others charged with ignoring and or covering up potential evidence, the town of Steubenville was divided. Instead of working to understand the root causes of this terrible rupture, many residents felt victimized by the unwanted media attention and emphasized how overblown the reaction was to the rape. They stressed Jane Doe's complicity and split hairs about what constituted rape. If we want to understand what defines rape culture, then here it was, laid bare. I couldn't look away. I want to start with you, Nora, on you defining, if you can define, what is rape?
that's a really interesting question, and it's central to this case because the answer is, at least legally, rape means something different depending on where you are. In the state of Ohio, where Steubenville is, and where the assault and the whole case played out, rape includes digital penetration, which is, fingers in the vagina specifically, as well as intercourse, what we would think of, traditionally as rape. And when this case happened and the town was very divided and felt very defensive and protected, their boys in a certain way, there was a lot of complaints and talk about how this wasn't even really rape. And actually the sort of parsing of that language, those kinds of complaints really speak to what was going on in the town. This idea that they should be discussing whether this was really even that bad an assault versus saying this terrible thing happened to this young woman. What are we going to do to make sure these things don't happen again? Instead, it was like, well, this wasn't even a rape.
Mm-hmm. I think that's what really pulled me in with that passage that you wrote, is that people were talking about victimization from the national media that came in to cover this story, but they weren't able to make that leap from the victimization they felt to what Jane Doe would have felt being digitally penetrated by somebody without her consent. And
Yeah.
I think that irony, and that's probably not the right word, but that passage highlights to me the entire struggle of what this book really talks about, which is how do we make those leaps of empathy and understanding for other people in ways that don't demean the victim in these cases? And maybe that is the rape culture that we find we can easily understand, oh, the media is descending upon our town, but when it comes to this young woman who, for whatever reason, was in this situation, her body was defiled by somebody. And there seems to be a divide over whether that happened or not, or whether it rose to the level of what happened to the two boys who were involved in this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's ultimately what the book became about. And there were sort of various iterations of what this book might look like when Nancy and I began. But it really became about what is rape culture? Why is this case so important and seminal in terms of us understanding rape culture, and how insidious it is in certain ways? And what can we do, if anything, to mitigate rape culture,
Mm-hmm.
to create a culture that doesn't victim blame and victim shame, and that actually doesn't enable a kind of gender inequality that then leads to these kinds of situations.
Nora, can you lay out sort of the basic details of the book so people can understand before we go deeper what happened to Jane Doe?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the evening of August 11th in 2012, there was a scrimmage football game at Steubenville High School in Steubenville, Ohio. And after that football game, there was a house party. At that house party were kids from all different schools around the area, including two boys who were on the Steubenville football team and were like rising stars on the team. Trent Mays was one of them, and the other one is Malik Richmond. At the same time, a young woman who we will refer to as Jane Doe, who was actually from just over the border in West Virginia, was sleeping at a friend's house across the street from the party, and they snuck out, as teenagers will do, to go to the party. And Jane Doe had actually been talking to Trent a little bit. There was like some texting going on, some sort of idea that maybe they were into each other. But this was, like the first time hanging out in person in a real way. Everybody got really drunk. Jane Doe got really drunk. Whether or not she was drugged remains unclear. But basically, she got drunker than her friends had ever seen her, from what they felt like wasn't very much alcohol, or at least wasn't more than she might drink on a different night. And the boys and some other friends of theirs ended up taking her to a second party, despite her friends' protests. They took her to this second party, and later, by the way, they would be charged initially, although these charges got dropped, they would be initially charged with kidnapping for taking her. Because once you're past the point of consent, if someone is taking you somewhere and the friends are saying don't do it, it's not clear whether she was in a position to be able to consent at all. They got to a second party, which the police would end up calling Party B. At Party B, which was at a kid named Jake Haworth's house, she threw up. She could barely stand up. She fell over. Everybody saw how drunk she was. Instead of feeling sympathy for her, a lot of them sort of judged her, laughed at her. She threw up outside. Malik Richmond actually held her hair while she was throwing up. She took off her shirt because it had vomit on it. And then she was asked to leave. And because she was so out of it, the boys, including Malik Richmond and Trent Mays, carried her out by her limbs. And another friend of theirs, who actually had been an ex-boyfriend of hers, his name was Cody, snapped a picture. And that picture would go on to become kind of an infamous picture because they ended up posting it on social media. And that's what was going on throughout this whole time. And this is one of the things that makes this case incredibly unique, is that they were the kids, not just those two boys, but their friends and even their friends' friends were posting what was happening on Twitter and texting each other about it as if it was so funny that she was so drunk. And the things that they were saying were really, really horrifying. And they left what would become a digital trail of breadcrumbs, basically, for the police. Ultimately, she got put in the car again. She was sexually assaulted for the first time in the car, and then driven to a third location, Party C, which was a kid named Mark Cole's house, where she was stripped naked and sexually assaulted again by Trent Mays and Malik Richmond, and perhaps others, but that's what the proof is. A kid named Anthony, no, I'm blanking on his last name, but anyway, another kid was going back and forth between this Party C and back to Party B. And he took a picture of her on the floor, or at least somehow had a picture of her naked on the floor with the boys behind her in various ways, and took it back to the other house, showed it to the boys at that house, at which point one of the boys there, Michael Nodianis, began delivering this, what would be this 12-minute comedy routine, basically video, about how funny it was that she was being raped, basically. It was like, she's so raped, she's like that. And that video, one of the other boys posted online for everyone else to watch. And that video too would become really infamous later on. But anyway, she went to sleep, she woke up, she didn't know where she was naked, she had lost 7 hours, she couldn't remember a single thing. And from there, things spiraled. At first, there was just, it's a small town, there was chatter about everything that had happened. Word started to get out. Her parents found out. She started to find out what happened via pictures of herself online and reports from other people. She and her parents filed charges at the police department, arrived with, a drive full of images and tweets and all this stuff from the internet. People started erasing tweets, trying to erase sort of the trail of what happened. And essentially, after much investigation, Malik Richmond and Trent Mays were arrested for her rape. And after that, it was still, not a huge story. This is still a small town in Ohio. And I mean, football players, unfortunately, high school football players raping a high school girl isn't particularly unusual or big news often. But what ended up happening is that first, this crime blogger named Alex Goddard got wind of what had happened. She used to live in Steubenville, knew what sort of the culture of the place was, and decided to do this deep dive and investigate. And she basically unearthed all of these tweets that had been erased. So that had happened. And then this reporter, Rachel DeSalle at the Plain Dealer, which is the big Cleveland paper, got a tip about the story, an anonymous tip. She got sent to investigate it, wrote a feature about it. The New York Times wrote a feature about it. Things started to sort of pick up steam, partially because the boys were arrested, and the boys were arrested because there had been this crazy trail that they left of what had happened. And then sort of the final thing that happened to propel this onto the national stage is that the hacking collective Anonymous got wind of it. And Anonymous made this video, or a member of Anonymous, although it's an anarchy collective, made this video warning the town, basically putting the town on warning, like, if you don't hold people accountable by this date, we're going to dox you, which is like release people's personal information. And in the end, what they ended up doing was leaking the 12-minute Nodianis video. And it was actually like so much more damning than anything else they could have done, because when people watched that video of this young man saying all these horrible things about this girl and laughing, and all the boys laughing with him about this girl being raped, there was no way to look away from what was really happening.
Mhm.
Sort of in the vein of what the quote you brought up, like it was rape culture on parade, right? There was no way for people to unsee what they were seeing or to deny the reality of what they were seeing. And from there, the case became a huge national story, and it was the first rape case to ever go viral, really. And it set the stage for some other rape cases that after that would then also go viral. For instance, Daisy Coleman, um, Chanel Miller, who was raped by Brock Turner at Stanford. These other cases that sort of people began talking about more.
I think it's important to lay out the steps because I think every step along the way, there were opportunities for people to intervene. There were opportunities for people to help her. There were opportunities for adults to do the right thing, and that didn't happen.
Yeah.
And I think it may be easy to sit here today, 11 years past that, and have a lot of judgment around what happened there. But you talk about in the book, you and Nancy talk about in the book something called separate sphere ideology. And you talk about, and if I'm understanding this correctly, you talk about separate sphere ideology being almost like all these different roles that people fell into that prevented anyone from helping Jane Doe in this process. And you talk about bystander syndrome. You talk about masculinity panic. You talk about how boys evaluate each other on their homosexuality scale. How gay are you? This idea of groupthink and pack mentality and these very rigid gender roles that people have to play. And then ultimately slut shaming that came into play to really leave Jane Doe defenseless in this situation.
Yeah.
Can you go deeper into this whole idea of separate sphere ideology? Because I think it really was at play here.
Yes, absolutely. And I do want to say I'm not an expert on separate sphere ideology, and we interviewed a lot of people. I found it totally fascinating. But my understanding of separate sphere ideology is basically that it talks about cultures in which the genders are treated as completely separate beings with completely separate roles. And often in these situations, as we know, that's a hierarchy, right? So often, and most often, a hierarchy that finds men, higher and women lower on the totem pole. And so actually a really good example would be football culture, actually, which comes into play in the book a lot as well, because it's a culture in which there actually is no space for women, except perhaps like in skimpy outfits on, as cheerleaders on the field. This is becoming slightly less the case as time goes on, but it's male players, it's physical, it's violent, it's about male coaches and men on the sidelines, and in this case at Steubenville, even like male priests um, on the sidelines. And so it's a good example of a culture in which stereotypes about both genders and biases sort of run rampant because there's no overlap. There's just this sense of these two disparate, ways of being. And so there's no grounds for discussion, there's no grounds for conversation. And so the idea is that the more that we see men and women in these completely separate ways, the more that the cultures are allowed to sort of run rampant, that in which the men have one role and the women have another, and the roles are not shared. There's no empathy, and basically so issues like rape culture thrive.
What really comes through as you're describing the separate sphere ideology, and I think what the book does really well is that it contextualizes this entire event. I think there's an idea, there's a mythology in our culture that there was some point in sort of middle America, in sort of the Rust Belt of America, in these manufacturing towns when there were these golden years, when people were very happy and there were these sort of halcyon days. But as you guys were doing the work on the book, you sort of debunked this myth that those days even existed, because even in those days, there was a high rate of violence and sexual abuse towards women that you were able to uncover. that even within the workplace itself, there were these really strong hierarchies of management and non-management and how that played out in the social setting. And it made me feel like, as I was reading, did these kids in Steubenville even have a choice? Were they
Right.
going to end up, was it going to be Jane Doe or was it going to be someone else, that they were going to end up in this situation because the die had been cast?
Well, one thing I should just say is that this was a project that Nancy brought to me, not the other way around. When this project began, the book version of this project began, she had already made a documentary about the town, and that meant that she spent 3 years moving in and out of that town, getting to know the people, getting to have like a really in-depth understanding of what it was to be in that place. So she had like a pretty nuanced and complex understanding of Steubenville as sort of a microcosm also for other small towns in like our heartland. And so I think that, I don't want to speak for her, but Nancy, I think she questioned that a lot. And that's something that we talked about a lot. Like, what were the opportunities for these boys? And the reality is that once the steel mills closed and things deteriorated financially, there isn't a lot of opportunity in Steubenville. Some of the young adults we talked to who had graduated at the same time as these boys and had come back said that coming back to the town, there isn't a lot that you can to do there. Even if you get to go to college, which actually, a decent portion of them seem to go to college, but that in coming back to Steubenville, there's not a lot of opportunity. Um, you know, I know Nancy sort of lamented seeing like some of them became like MMA fighters, and like it just felt like there wasn't a lot of room for them to grow in positive ways. So that's true. But what I would say is that what struck me was that the culture of not taking responsibility for our choices and our actions was so rampant in the town that seemed to me to tamp down the opportunity more than anything else. That this idea that you would just sit in your anger, that somebody else is taking something away from you, that someone is here to take your jobs, that you aren't being offered the opportunities that you should be being offered. This idea of blaming others instead of this idea that a rising tide, raises all boats. That to me seems like the most insidious piece, or at least one of them, another insidious piece. That on top of not having opportunity, there's this culture of anger and blame, which also feels very like Trumpian to me. And is probably why the way that Trump talked about things really appealed to a lot of the men in this place, in this culture. Because there's this idea of someone's trying to take something from you, we need to act. This town so entrenched, so determined not to progress forward, but to stay the same. The fact that there's no acknowledgement of the fact that the world is changing, and like it or not, you've got to find a way to move along with it. Instead, this idea that you should just hunker down and try to hold on to these old ways, which, as you acknowledged, weren't actually that great anyway for marginalized people of all kinds.
Right.
So to me, like there's sort of a perfect storm of issues that put the boys in a position where, they were likely to have behaved poorly.
It's almost like, I wonder if there was a way to even, I think my question is really around this idea of people not having choices and what they do with that, what they do when they come to that moment when they have to make a choice about what type of person they're going to be and what kind of choices they're going to make. I think, again, it's very easy to judge what Trent and Malik did because it's egregious. And there were other players in this that we'll talk about as well that I just sort of scratched in my head. But then I also look at, well, how does this kind of behavior get replicated in our culture in ways that aren't so dramatic, but still inform what they did and how they behaved and how they approached the entire situation? Plus, we haven't even talked about the role that alcohol played in it.
I mean, it's really complicated and also very nuanced because, right, you're talking about, well, what are the factors that propel people towards making certain decisions? But at the same time, you're also, well, the first thing you're looking at is people are different, right? So the first question is, are Malik and Trent the same? They don't come from the same backgrounds. Trent is white, Malik is black. Trent comes from a household with two married parents, like a more middle class household. Malik comes from, a more broken home.
He's adopted by his family, I believe.
Well, he had guardians, like white guardians, who it's very much like a Blind Side kind of story, where basically, I mean, I don't want to say when he showed athletic prowess or like talent, but it sort of appears that way. But hopefully, they took interest for other reasons. And his family was struggling. This family took him in for a period of time, off and on, and sort of tried to shepherd him, took care of him. So there's the question of their backgrounds. There's the question of who they both are, just sort of at core. A lot of people felt like Trent seemed sort of unapologetic, while Malik seemed to feel legitimate remorse. He broke down into hysterical tears at the end of the trial as he was apologizing. So there's the question of who they both are, and then there's the question of the culture itself. As you said, there's small things that are happening all the time, and the basis of like a patriarchal society in which rape culture flourishes are small examples of women's roles versus men's roles. Stay-at-home moms who, even if they wanted to leave, don't have the means to do so. Only men in the workplace. Women not having a seat at the table. Positions of power in government, in the school board, in all of these kinds of positions. A culture that covers up the bad behavior of men for so long that women are complicit in it. Have become so accustomed to, pretending away the various kinds of assault, that they too are just trying to protect their boys because that's what you do. A town in which there is so little opportunity, or as you said, sort of so little to grab onto, that football is everything.
Right.
And that to lose football is to lose, the whole spirit of the town. So there's so many different pieces. And actually, one interesting example to me is Coach Reno, who's the football coach at Steubenville High School, and is a complicated figure because he is basically the kingpin of the town. Nothing happens, especially with these boys, that doesn't go through him. And in fact, when the rape happened, he was like one of the first people Trent Mays called when people started to talk about, oh, wait, there may be consequences for this. He was one of the first people that Trent Mays called and was like, what do I do? She's saying this happened, Nancy felt complicated, I think, about him, Coach Reno, because he reminded her of, men in her life that she knew who she really loved. Those kinds of older men who, in the best case scenario, create a sense of kind of comfort. She felt for him. By the time she met him, which was a year after the crime, she felt like he seemed legitimately confused by what had happened, the way the world had changed, like legitimately unable to adjust, though he wanted to. That in some ways, his intentions were good. He wanted to protect the kids. He was in service to these boys all the time. The ones who didn't have stable homes, he helped them. He gave girls money for prom dresses. He did all of these things to take care of. He promoted ideas about loyalty. He made the boys do philanthropic work, whatever. The problem is that the loyalty was to each other. And then later, when she finally got her hands on the police interviews and she watched Coach Reno's police interview, she was horrified, because the way that he speaks in that environment, when he's just with adult men and he doesn't really know that someone's going to see it, is disturbing, to say the least, and shows a real disregard for this young woman, and young women in general. And one thing that really stuck out for me, can I curse?
You can curse.
One thing that really stuck out for me was the language he used around talking about what happened to Jane Doe.
Yeah.
That I felt like it's one thing for him to say, well, is this even really rape? Because he was one of the people who expressed that question, who asked that question, and defended the boys and in certain ways, and said, well, I told them to be honest with me, and if they were honest with me, I would protect them, and they said they didn't do it. So, but the language he used when talking about them having sex with her, when he said they screwed her, they fucked her, whatever, and this is like a 16-year-old child, or 15, I think she was at the time, that really stuck out for me. Like, because even though he may not even have any sense of himself as sort of perpetrating rape culture, being part of the patriarchy, the reality of the situation is that his view of women is still as objects.
Right.
You know, and sure, he feels in defense of these boys who he knows well, and not this young woman who he doesn't have a relationship with. But the idea that you would so crassly talk about a young woman that way, about her body, a child, really, really stuck out to me. So these are the small ways, you know, he probably wasn't even aware of that, you
Mhm.
know.
And he's, you
But
know, he's such a complicated figure because at times in the book I was rooting for him, and then after I read the book, I watched the documentary, and obviously my view shifted about him because of those tapes that they showed. But to me, he represents this figure that you really want, this sort of avuncular figure who you really want to believe that they can make it right. And then at the end of the day, they're just as blind to what they're existing within as everyone else. And I also think he showed very little contrition around any of it from my perspective. And that could just be how I read the book and what I saw in the documentary. But I didn't see a great deal of contrition around what he did and how he comported himself during this entire nightmare that this town was living through.
yeah, I mean, he didn't give a lot of interviews. So like, I think Nancy spent a lot of time talking to him off the record, but he really wouldn't like go on the record very much. So I think that it's a little hard to understand exactly what his arc is. I mean, she at least felt like he had been somewhat humbled by the time she met him. At least, like, when the New York Times reporters first came, they reported that he yelled at them to get the fuck out, you know. And
Yeah.
yeah, by the time she came, that wasn't the reception she got. But clearly nothing really seemed to change in terms of the way the town was operating. And actually, one of the other really striking things, which speaks to his sort of influence and power, though less to his journey, is that when news started to get to the, you know, to reach the school officials about what had happened before anyone was arrested, perhaps even only when the police were maybe first involved or even not yet involved, instead of the superintendent or the principal handling the situation, or them going to law enforcement and saying, okay, we don't know what happened, but something happened. They put Coach in charge of dealing with his players, and what he chose to do was say to them, did you do this? And they said no, and he was like, okay.
He was done with it. He was like, all right.
He was done with it. And especially interesting because even for drinking, they should have been suspended for the team, just from the team. But he was afraid to acknowledge, he said later in police interviews, that he didn't want to acknowledge that they had been drinking because he thought it made them look guilty.
Hmm.
And he actually also encouraged them to stop texting each other because they were still, after the fact, like, unwisely texting each other. I mean, one of the things that makes this case really fascinating too is that it's right as social media sort of comes into the mainstream. And so they really didn't understand the repercussions of social media. Like, they really didn't understand how permanent what you post is, like what you put online. And it seems to us like so incredibly stupid, I have to say, to post everything that you're doing online, to live tweet, you know, your crime, um, with glee, you know. But they really didn't have a full understanding, and they didn't understand that about their text to each other as well.
And I think if we pull it out a little bit, Nora, I think it can become super easy to sort of denigrate small towns and talk about, you know, what's happening in the Midwest. And, you know, those exact same principles, those exact same dynamics were at play in Hollywood with Harvey Weinstein, right? So it's not about location. It's about what has grown and festered in our culture for hundreds of years, and before that, it's never been we've never lived in a pro-woman time. But we can look back through history and go, okay, that was the pro-woman moment in history. I think it's always been a patriarchy that has dictated what women can do with their bodies, what they can't do with their bodies, who they can marry, who they can't marry, what kind of jobs they can have. It is literally, it's endemic.
Yes, and we're all complicit. And that's part of the reason why the town hunkered down so hardcore. I mean, that's at least one of my beliefs about why would you be so resistant to change? Like, why would you be so unwilling to acknowledge that this thing happened? To protect your daughters, and your wives, your mothers. Because another thing that happened is that in the wake of the trial and all of this happening is that these rallies, well, sort of put together by Anonymous, but these rallies started happening where women from the area started just coming out of the woodwork, telling their stories. I mean, and you could not believe the number of stories about the sexual assault and violence perpetrated against women,
At that part in the book, and even in the documentary, I kept waiting for the turn. I kept waiting for, that moment when everyone goes, oh, okay, we get it. And it never comes, which I think was disappointing.
It's so much easier to hunker down and sort of be defensive, and say like, well, they won't leave us alone,
Right.
leave us, we're being victimized or whatever, than it is to say we have a systemic problem at every level of our culture and we are complicit in it. We are part of the problem. The way that, like, after Jane Doe was assaulted, of course, all these other young women and also adult women came out of the woodwork talking about how she had dressed, how she was promiscuous, all those classic things that people shame victims. It's like almost like a way of deflecting, a way for us to not have to say like, okay, I'm part of this problem.
Mm-hmm.
How can I change my behavior so that this whole culture can start to change? It's much easier to say like, well, we didn't mean it that way. And that girl was a slut and she doesn't know. And actually, I was going to say, Patrick, one of the really, really horrible, but very fascinating things that happened at the very end of writing this book is that there was a court case that came up about a man who had at one point worked in the Steubenville school system, but wasn't anymore at this point, but who had lived locally, who had sexually assaulted 3 children and a teenager, for over the course of about a decade, like systemic abuse of these 3 children / teenagers. And it only came out, whenever, like 2 years ago, and he was convicted. The children, now adults, testified, and one of them was a primary boy involved in Jane Doe's assault. He wasn't Malik and it wasn't Trent, but it was one of the boys who had been involved in the assault, had like laughed about it, had tweeted about it, and it really, really made me think about this idea that if you don't protect one kid, then you don't protect anyone.
Right.
If you're not willing to protect this young woman, then you're not protecting your son. You're not protecting all of the children. So that there has to be some understanding about, well, sort of what you were saying, empathy and understanding this idea that the culture itself has to be approached, examined, assessed, looked at, shifted in order for anybody to be safe.
Well, it's because we've been able to compartmentalize and sort of otherize people and say, well, my kid is safe, or it doesn't apply to me. And I think what you bring up leads me to this other thought that I had about the book that was in the book itself, is that, Steubenville is considered Pittsburgh Steeler country. It's very close to Pennsylvania. And in the book, you all talk about what happened with Jerry Sandusky and how people were pretty quick to understand that that was not right, what he did, that it was incredibly wrong. And in the book, there's sort of a lament that where was that sort of upswelling of response and indignation about what happened to Jane Doe? And you guys quote David Zarin, who says, with Penn State, because of the history of homophobia in the locker room, the idea of men having sex with boys inside that space generated a degree of outrage that was just. And I recalled wanting a similar amount of response to gendered violence in sports. He says, there's a boys will be boys edge to how violence against women is looked at, especially at high school and collegiate levels. And there was a culture of cover-ups. We saw that cover-up at Penn State, but it's just about the reaction when the stories meet the oxygen. Reaction is quite different depending on who the survivor is in the case.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's this idea actually, which I actually, Nancy introduced me to, that I hadn't really known about, which makes total sense, which is this idea of the perfect victim. Somebody's not really a victim unless they are pure in certain ways, right? First of all, people in glass houses, right? How many of us are walking around pure in any way, you know? But yes, this idea that you have to dress a certain way, you have to have conducted yourself sexually a certain way, you know, all of these things, you have to have not drank alcohol or, you know, in order to be worthy of victimhood, of sympathy, you know. And I guess I thought that was really interesting, what David Zirin said about that. Because yeah, there's so much discomfort around homosexuality that is instantly a horrifying concept, but things get grayer when it's about boys and girls, men and women.
There's also probably a belief that, well, maybe the women are supposed to like this.
Right. I mean, and they're star football players, you know, so it's like, well, she wanted that anyway. She liked Trent, maybe. She thought that there was something. I mean, that's what made her a perfect victim in the other sense of the word, in the way that the prosecutor taught in this case talked about her. She was out of her element. She wasn't in West Virginia. She was the person that, like, really, she really didn't really know anyone there. She thought that this boy actually liked her potentially. You know, she was also like the perfect victim for them to choose for all of those reasons, all of the reasons, the things that made her vulnerable.
You know, it was interesting as I was thinking about the book and thinking about rape culture. I thought about Maureen Dowd at the New York Times and how, and I started doing some research and I was reading some of the things that she had said about Monica Lewinsky back in 1998. And she writes of Lewinsky that the former White House intern has been painted as more mall rat than policy wonk, a valley girl more absorbed by the expansion of her waist than by the expansion of NATO, more concerned with waxing eyebrows than with waning hopes for peace in the Middle East. And then she just goes right in February of 1998 and says that Lewinsky is a ditzy, predatory White House intern who might have lied under oath for a job at Revlon, juxtaposing that to what she said in 2017 after the Me Too movement started. And she writes, there's a rough justice in this initial barrage of j'accuses before people work out hierarchy of sins and due process, which I think we're talking about now. That may stem from the decades when so many women accusers, from Anita Hill to Bill Clinton's Inamorata and Frey, she still doesn't call her by her name,
Right.
were treated as collateral damage, smeared and pushed aside so that the careers of powerful men could be preserved.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you know, certain things don't age well.
Not at all.
There's a lot of different ideas that came up while we were researching this book about why women come down so hard on each other, why the victim of a rape also often will be isolated, sort of dropped by her friend group, those kinds of things. And what came up was a lot about wanting to create, actually speaking to what you were speaking to, this idea that if you can convince yourself and others that this only happens to bad people, to people who deserved it, to people who aren't pure, aren't perfect victims, then you're safe, right? Then you don't need to confront this idea that this could happen to you. Then you can make it about other people, and you don't have to make it about you or your mom or your sister or your child, you know? So there's a sense of wanting to separate yourself socially because that person is now kind of a social pariah, who the boys now don't like, probably, you know, but also just to create kind of a false sense of security, making the victim somebody who's different from you, who somehow created their own situation and is responsible for it, right? Pushing the responsibility along
Yeah.
again as well, you
It
know.
was interesting. I think I was thinking about Attica Locke, who you know, Attica, who's a writer. Her books are set in Texas, and I asked her when I spoke to her on this show about why she wrote about Texas, and she said, you know, that she finally had to just own that she loved Texas, and then the reasons that she enumerated were because it invited her to hold the complexities of loving a place that didn't always love her back.
Right.
And that she felt that when she was able to hold two complex thoughts, that she was able to hold this and that, which were conflicting thoughts, that it gave her a sense of freedom. And I
Right.
wonder if part of the challenge with this entire story is that we can't hold the complexity of it. We can't hold the fact that you can still be a prostitute or an escort who's working as a sex worker, but you can still be raped.
Right.
And I think we just don't have either the desire or the ability to hold conflicting ideas about things. So it just becomes easier to say, well, she asked for it.
Right. It's one way or the other. Yeah, I think it's hard to hold the complexity of it. I also think that we live in a culture that really isn't interested in nuance or layers of why something happens or what comprises something. You know, for example, just going back to the idea of Trent and Malik and the difference between them, can you look at a situation and just say point blank, it's 100% this way, or it's 100% that way? You know, not really. And this, of course, brings in the idea of restorative justice, which comes up a bit in the book as well. Is it possible? You know, it's like in the wake of something we feel terrible happening, or an act that we feel is terrible, we naturally want to see that person punished for having enacted it. But the question is, in the wake of that punishment, can somebody change? You know, can somebody learn from what they did and come out of it a different person? Is punishment really the solution? When, or the best way basically to teach people to behave differently? And actually, again, looking at Trent and Malik, it's hard to say, right? Malik came out of that situation and he finished high school, and he wasn't allowed to play on the team for the first like year, and then he was allowed to play on the team, and it was Coach Reno's choice whether he played or not. You know,
Right.
nobody asked the girls in the school, or, you know, Jane Joe's family, or, you know,
Yeah.
but he was allowed to play high school football, and then he went to college, and at college he was going to play, I think is what happened, and then there was student protest, and so the school said he couldn't play, and he ended up suing the school to allow him to play, and he did. And at least as far as we know, we haven't heard anything about him reoffending, um, or doing anything in that vein. And also, it should be noted that he got 1 year, um, whereas Trent Mays got 2 years, and they were tried as juveniles, so it wasn't in prison; it was in, you know, juvenile hall. Whereas Trent Mays, you know, there have not been charges filed against him since then either, and he went and finished high school elsewhere, and then went to college, and was then funneled into a slightly better college because of football, and was also playing. Um, but the rumors are that he reoffended more, you know, and again with photos, there were complaints. So I mean, and the sense of many people sort of surrounding the case were that he was more of an actual predator, whereas Malik was just sort of trying a follower. So nuance is important, right? Because maybe a more restorative justice approach works for a Malik, and maybe it doesn't for a Trent. You know,
Right.
it's hard to say. I think it's complicated, and I do think that it's very hard for us to conceive of this idea that things are not 100% one way or 100% the other way. But again, I often think it just comes back down to our unwillingness to acknowledge our own complicity,
Mm.
of wanting to say, like, we're walking around behaving as if we are like empowered in certain ways, in like in the culture I live in, at least, in my little nook in Brooklyn. But there's still, every day you're still observing certain kinds of gender dynamics and inequities. The women carrying the large portion of the mental load for the whole household, like that's still a reality. Um, and as long as those kinds of things are going on, the inequity continues. I think that there's some sense that when we talk about not wanting to perpetuate toxic masculinity, I think there's some sense that that means that men should be neutered in some way or should behave like women or whatever that might mean to people. But the reality is that the idea of toxic masculinity is really about the notion that there are only very specific ways to behave in order to be perceived as masculine, and that those ways have to do with not only being dominant but asserting dominance over others. And so I think that again, it's hard. These are difficult concepts to wrap our minds around, and it's much easier to just sort of put up a wall and be like, no thank you, you know we're going to stay in 1952. You enjoy 2023, which is not always that enjoyable a time.
Here's the piece that may not be PC of me to say, but I think it can become very male female in this toxic masculinity discussion. But I also think that those gender roles that aren't tied to your sexual parts can play out in same-sex relationships, and I think they do.
I completely agree. And some of it, right, doesn't even have to do with gender. It has to do with just cultural norms, traditional roles in a family. Yes, 100%. I feel like I see that play out all the time.
So Nora, you have a son and a daughter, and I wonder what working on this book will impact or has impacted how you've raised him and how you are raising her.
For my daughter, it's somewhat simpler for me. I was always going to raise her to never leave a friend at a party, to never accept a drink from a person you don't know, to walk down the white line in the middle of the street on your way home so no one jumps out from behind a car if you're walking alone at night. I was always going to teach her those things because that's what it is to be a woman in the world. And actually, it's funny. Yeah, he's quite young, but he has recently become obsessed with football. He loves football. He knows the record of every team. He watches every game that we will allow him to watch. I mean, he is just completely obsessed. So that presents an interesting problem to me, right?
Yeah.
The question is like, how do I approach this for him? And so what do we do? The best thing I can do for him, I think, is talk about it openly. Say like, well, where are the women? Why are there no women on this field? Where are the women here? To talk about, to acknowledge the absence in certain ways, we talk about, we don't support players who we know have behaved badly in certain ways. We don't support teams that allow those players, to still be on their teams and pay them enormous salaries. Even in my husband's fantasy league, he says, I won't draft a player who has, been in trouble in these ways. But I think as much as we talk to them and we say, we try to emphasize kindness, we talk about don't touch someone's body without consent. We talk about consent over and over again. To repeat these things over and over again, to find examples in real life, small examples, as you said, for the ways in which these behaviors can kind of creep in, that's the best we can do. And then I think like actions speak louder than words, right? I'm fortunate enough to have a husband who shares household duties and childcare duties with me. And so there's an example of a man who isn't creating those kind of separate sphere ideologies in the household, at least, at least not to an extreme. Writing this book certainly made me more thoughtful. And I do think it is as important, if not more important, to teach boys about all of this. And that's something Nancy sort of taught me, because she felt really strongly that the best path forward in a lot of ways is allyship, is men talking to boys and men about these behaviors and having safe spaces where they can actually talk about what's really happening and not necessarily get canceled for having thoughts and opinions that aren't what they ideally would be, but actually like talk through these ideas.
I don't think cancel culture is helping anybody in this process.
No, it doesn't seem like it. It seems like in general in life, it seems like when things are really extremely in one direction, it's not ideal. That the more moderate we can be, the more we can sort of actually listen to each other, actually have empathy, find ways to teach instead of punish, that these are ideal situations. Not always possible, but in an ideal world.
Nora, thank you for today. Heavy conversation, but I think a necessary conversation for sure.
Yeah, I think so too. Thank you so much, Patrick. I'm so glad to get to sit down with you at any time, but it was really good to talk about this.
And thank you, Nancy, for the documentary and for covering this story, because I know it was not easy. So thank you for that too, Nancy, if you're watching. To those of you who are watching or listening, remember, we all have a voice. Use yours wisely. Bye, everyone. Thank you, Nora.